Thanks very much for joining us. My name is Mike Knights, and I'm with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm the Jill and Jay Bernstein Fellow. Welcome to Pursuing a Stable Peace in Yemen that Serves US Interests. I'm really delighted to be joined here today by Nadwa al-Dawsari from the Middle East Institute, a non-resident fellow at Middle East Institute, and also Ambassador Steve Fagin, who is the US ambassador to Yemen also. It's a delight to have all three of you here today to talk about the pressing issue of Yemen. Recently, we have been doing a lot of writing about Yemen at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In particular, we have a policy piece, An Heir and a Spare, which looks at how the new Southern Hezbollah of the Houthi movement has evolved and what kind of challenges it presents to US policy and the policy of our partners within the region. And then more recently, in April 2024, we also have the new piece in West Point Combating Terrorism Center, CTC Sentinel, which is an extensive look at assessing the Houthi war effort since October 2023, that really looks at the military technical aspects and how Operation Prosperity Guardian has, if at all, affected Houthi anti-shipping attacks in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. So today, we're going to be talking about something that's potentially far removed from the war that we see around us in the Red Sea, in Yemen more broadly in the region. We have since Friday, around 8 to 10 attacks by the Houthis against shipping in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. We have the fifth US Predator drone shot down in mid-May. Of this conflict. We have potentially major resupply of Houthis using larger capital ships calling at the ports of Hodeidah for the first time. We also have escalating economic war between the Houthis and the anti-Houthi factions inside Yemen, with the Houthis beginning to mint their own currency and with the Central Bank of Yemen beginning to threaten that Houthi banks in the Sana'a area will be disconnected from the international financial system from June the 2nd onwards, unless this activity stops and unless the Houthis allow oil and gas transfers to begin from the federal government to the international markets. So, we see all around us signs of escalation, but in the background, diplomats are still working tirelessly to bring peace to the Yemeni civil war. And the question for today is, what kind of peace are we going to be looking at? The Middle East is no stranger to short-term peace initiatives that cause long-term, generational, sometimes century-spanning negative effects. We seek a peace that's lasting, just, and one that serves the interests of the US and its strategic partners in the region. And that's why Washington Institute has convened our distinguished speakers to join us today to ask, what kind of peace are we pursuing, ideally, practically, and so on. So next, if I can, I'll turn to you again, Nadwa. From a Yemeni perspective, and I know you've got to then put a lot of different hats on potentially, but overall, for the country and for the different component parts of the country, what do you think constitutes a good peace versus a bad peace? What peace is going to sow the seed of future conflict? And what are the aspects of a peace that could actually stick and help the country to begin to recover?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being in this webinar. Allow me to dream. Peace for Yemenis is pretty simple. Yemenis need an end of violence, first of all. They need a functioning government. They don't want armed groups to be running around and destroying their lives. They need roads to be open. They need airports to be open. They need salaries. They need to go back to their homes without fear of prosecution. It's pretty simple. straightforward. Ideally, that could happen, that should happen through dialogue, where all Yemeni parties come together, including the Houthis, and agree on a transition, agree on some sort of formula to share power and serve Yemenis. That's ideal. But this is the real world, and it doesn't work like that. I think we need to learn from history to see what's coming. And I don't know if dialogue with the Houthis is going to achieve this. We've been doing dialogue with the Houthis since 2014. The problem is that, well, I mean, dialogue with all other Yemeni actors, I think all other Yemeni actors could come to an agreement, but I don't think the Houthis would. And that's because the Houthis do not see themselves only as the only representatives of Yemenis, which is true. That's how they see themselves. But they see themselves as a group that's on a global jihadist mission. And we've seen elements of that in the Red Sea attacks. The Houthis have used negotiations to stall and to exploit, and they're really good at exploiting. They have exploited the increase in prices, the price hike in 2014 to overrun the capital. They've exploited their opponents or their rivals' divisions. They have exploited the UN desire to achieve a signed agreement. They've exploited the Saudis' desire to be out of Yemen. And so they're really good at exploiting. I think we should look at what happened in 2018. My favorite topic, the Stockholm Agreement. That was an agreement brokered by the UN, backed by the international community. The US made that agreement happen against all warnings by all Yemenis, myself included. We've said that will only embolden the Houthis, and that will make them a threat to the Red Sea. Fast forward 5 years later, they became a threat to international shipping and security. But what happened then was that the Houthis did agree. We've seen pictures of the Houthi delegation, shaking hands with the Yemeni delegation, and Martin Griffith happy, and the international community celebrating. And we were saying, wait for it, because we've seen that before. What happened then was that government forces were forced to be on the defensive, and the Houthis regrouped, and they escalated. And immediately after the Stockholm Agreement, in the next couple of years, they took 3 provinces, critical provinces, and now they're threatening Marib, which is the last stronghold of the Yemeni government in the north. So, and the Houthis now are on it's not about Yemen anymore. Now they're about achieving their long-term goal. They call the Red Sea attack as the promised conquest and the holy jihad. The Houthis want Jerusalem. They're turning Yemen into a recruitment camp for the jihadist army. Let's face it, this is a dilemma. This is a group that is driven by ideology. It's a transnational group. It's not controlled by Iran. Yes, they're Iran allies, and they owe how they've evolved into this superpower. Well, relatively speaking, by Yemen standards, to Iran's support, and also to the mismanagement of the war by the Saudi-led coalition. So they see themselves as more than we think. We're always like 2 steps behind, and the Houthis are 10 steps ahead. And they're strategic, and they're good at what they do, to achieve their objectives. And again, they're thinking strategic, and we're thinking tactical. I don't know. I mean, I would love to see a political negotiation that ends with an agreement that transforms Yemen from war towards peace. It's not going to happen overnight, but I would love to see that. I'm just skeptical because if anything we've learned over the past 10 years is that the Houthis are not interested in ending the war. They want war and they want more of it. And so, yeah.
So let me ask you then a question. You play this out. Let's say the roadmap, we have a breakthrough, it gets executed. People applaud, like at Stockholm, they applaud what's been achieved. Where do you think Yemen goes from that point onwards? Let's say that peace that has been designed and we've pursued it. Let's say that the Houthis are receiving 2014 levels of salaries. Let's say that, as is really the case at the moment, constraints on Houthi importation of anything from weapons to fuel to LPG tanks is gone. What does Yemen look like 2-3 years down the road from that roadmap? What do you think the Houthis do with that peace? And what do you think the other players do with that peace? And international players, as in Gulf states, how does it play out to you?
Yeah, but the Houthis have been mobilizing forces towards Marib, towards the south, towards Shabwa. We've seen that since the beginning of the war. Yes, there hasn't been like massive fighting, but the Houthis have been planning for the scenario after they signed the agreement with Saudi Arabia. The Houthis are very clear. This is a war between them and Saudi Arabia. That's how they perceive it. So this roadmap for the Houthis is a roadmap for Saudi's exit out of Yemen. And then Yemen is their business. It's not the business of the Saudis or the region or the international community. So what the Houthis will do after signing this agreement, well, the Saudis will go to, focusing on their domestic priorities, which I understand. The Houthis will mobilize. They'll march towards Marib. They'll march towards the south. They'll escalate domestically. They'll escalate within Yemen, and then we will see an increase in violence within the country, fighting that we haven't seen before, and they'll start taking over areas. They'll probably start with Marib and then move towards Shabwa, Hadramaut, easy, take the oil, rich governorates, and then move towards the south. And the way I see it, the Houthis are superior militarily to every other force, or the other forces combined. They have the missiles. They have they have the strategy. They have the skill. They have more than that. They have the commitment to take all the country. So we're going to see an escalation in violence. We're going to see the Houthis basically trying to take all the country. And even if they take the country, that's not going to be the end of the violence, because the Houthis don't see themselves as, the force that's only that only controls Yemen. They see themselves as a regional and international and global actor rather than the just Yemeni actor.
So from a Yemeni perspective, if you were to say, okay, let's keep some of the elements of that roadmap, but let's safeguard it. Let's put the safeguards in that mean you can have a peace process, because abandonment of the entire peace process is not likely for internationals, for Saudi, for anyone. But improvement of the peace process could be possible. What are a couple of safeguards that can be injected into this process, whether it's about mindset or whether it's about specific aspects of the agreement that can prevent this from being easily exploited by the Houthis to greatly expand their control inside Yemen the day after a peace process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was talking to some diplomats involved in Yemen a couple of months ago in Jordan, and everybody's preparing for the roadmap for peace, and that's great. We need to prepare for peace. We want peace. Ideally, we want peace through dialogue. But is anybody preparing for war or violence or escalation? The way I see it, the Houthis are the only ones who are preparing for escalation, and everybody knows. Yet, everybody, the Saudis, the US, Europe, UK, the UN, everybody is pushing for peace, for de-escalation when the Houthis are preparing for escalation. So we need to be prepared for the worst case scenario, which in my opinion is the highly likely scenario to happen. we need to strengthen Yemeni government forces. We need to help them, train them, provide them with whatever it takes to stop the Houthis from expanding, to at least maintain the current or the status quo. And as Ambassador Al-Jaber said, every time the Houthis feel they're weak or they're losing, they come to the negotiation table. And then when they come to the negotiation table, they exploit that. They stall, they regroup, they make more military gains. So we should not trust the Houthis' promises to de-escalate. Not that they ever promised, by the way. It's just everybody interprets it that way. They've always been clear that Yemen is they're the only force that is legitimate to rule Yemen. So we need to support Yemeni forces to be able to stop the Houthis from expanding. That's number one. Number two, we need to continue to strengthen the Yemeni government. There are disagreements between the different forces within the Yemeni government, between the different political forces. And so that needs to be addressed. And I think the Saudis and the Emiratis are in a good place to make that happen. And then we also need to continue to support the Yemeni government to improve services. I mean, I don't know if you've heard the news in Aden. Every summer, it's the same story: electricity cuts, and people suffer. And then we have protests in the street. I mean, this has to end. Somebody has to put some money into improving services and commitment as well. So, yeah. So what I want to say is that yes, choose negotiations, but please don't be naive about it and learn from history.
They say if you wish for peace, prepare for war. And I think that's very, very apt in this particular case. So, just a final quick question for you. When the Houthis were checked at Marib, it was in part because the Saudis and the UAE had got their act together for once. And as they did that, as they worked together, we saw what was possible. Then they break apart again. Do you see any signs that on the Yemen file, Saudi and UAE are getting a little bit closer? We saw obviously a private meeting of the leaders. That doesn't necessarily mean anything's happening about Yemen specifically, but do you have more hope than fear for how Saudi UAE coordination is going to work in Yemen?
I think if the Saudis and the Emiratis come to an agreement to strengthen Yemeni forces, Yemeni political forces, we will see that manifest in agreement among these forces to run the country, but also to be prepared for Houthi escalation. Right now, I don't see that. It's not happening right now, but I hope that the Saudis and the Emiratis will do that, because if the Houthis take Yemen, all countries in the region are not immune, whether you share borders with Yemen or you don't. So I have a little bit of hope and I have fear.
That sounds about right for Yemen. Yeah, I think so. All right. So, Ambassador Fagin, it's really nice to have you. Thanks for being, gracious enough to listen and go third. Good tactical choice there too, I think. So let's hear from you. I mean, I'm very intrigued, and give us as much time as you can. We have an hour and a half in the schedule, but you just tell us how much time you've got. Essentially, yeah. What does a just and lasting peace look like here, practically speaking? I mean, and has the US view of a peace that will serve US interests, has that changed since October and the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and the redesignation or the designation as an SDGT of the Ansar Allah movement? Do you feel something significant changing in the way the US views this issue? Or is this a temporary phenomena, this current US Houthi direct confrontation? And just more generally, what are we trying to achieve in this peace deal here? It's going to be great once we got it, but the day after is going to be at least as important as the day of signing, whatever peace deal happens. Over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Mike, for letting me participate today. And I really appreciate the very thoughtful comments of my two colleagues. And I also appreciate the advantage of going last. Um, I think when it comes to an ideal end state for Yemen, our vision hasn't changed. And of course, it's hard to see that end state today, and it may not be achieved. But ideally, we want to see a Yemen that is at peace, on a path towards sustainable economic development, and a Yemen that does not pose serious threats to the region or the broader international community. And frankly, and I wanted to start out with that because you connected the peace process to U.S. interests in the title of this discussion today. I frankly think that that end state is what Yemenis want and what regional countries want as well. So that is the ideal end state. I think we also have to look at what has actually been achieved, despite a very difficult path ahead that lies ahead of us. You know, in early 2022 and late 2021, we still had a very hot conflict in Yemen. And thanks to a lot of diplomacy, US diplomacy, Saudi diplomacy, the work of the UN, we had that truce put in place. And even though it might have technically expired, its terms have largely been adhered to. And that has meant no military offensives inside of Yemen for the past 2 years, no Houthi attacks on Riyadh, on Abu Dhabi, with missiles and drones relating to the coalition's involvement in the conflict, and no coalition airstrikes in Yemen. And that is something we want to maintain. Look, 400,000 Yemenis have died directly and indirectly as a result of the conflict. From the US perspective, we don't support any parties going back to war inside of Yemen. We don't believe there's a military solution to the conflict. And then I also think that we, more broadly in the international community, recognize that for the foreseeable future, the Houthis are going to remain a political factor in Yemen that has to be grappled with. When it comes to a peace process and how we see that playing out in the long run, ultimately, and these are details that Yemenis have to decide because we're talking about a Yemeni peace process. But the expectation is that what we want, what we need, is a comprehensive political settlement in Yemen that will put the country on a path towards sustainable development and peace. And that presumably means that the sides ultimately negotiate some kind of transitional political, I would call it arrangement, that is in place for a couple of years. And then there is a final arrangement that has to be validated through an electoral process or multiple electoral processes. I can tell you right now that we are very far, certainly from that end state, and I think we are still far from that transitional political arrangement. What we have to do is to create the conditions that facilitates that peace process. I think the most recent developments with these unprecedented and illegal Houthi attacks on shipping actually make it even more important that we successfully facilitate a Yemeni peace process, because in the end, it's going to be Yemenis and the creation of a politically inclusive settlement that will be the factor that is brought to bear or can be brought to bear to contain these threats. As a practical matter, the Yemeni government is not going to sign a peace deal that allows the Houthis to have unbridled access to these weapons, to missiles and drones. It's just not going to happen that way. So we won't reach that settlement unless we can reach that kind of outcome. I said create the conditions, because that is really what we need to focus on doing. And here I go back to some things that Nadwa said. We have to continue down the path of strengthening the Yemeni government strengthening state institutions in Yemen, strengthening the role of Yemen's political parties, and the Houthis, of course, are not a political party, and strengthen the role of Yemeni civil society. So collectively, these institutions and these political forces are the means through which we can drive a real Yemeni peace process. I don't think this can be rushed. And Michael, you've mentioned something about signing a peace deal. But insofar as the sides were to sign the roadmap that the Saudis have worked on, that's been handed over to the UN, that is not, I think in all fairness, that is not a peace deal. That is the first step in this lengthy Yemeni peace process. The peace deal is the end state. And I think that that is realistically not on the immediate horizon. That shouldn't be a surprise, given Houthi intentions and Houthi motivations, but even on top of that, the very complicated nature of this conflict. I've worked in conflict and post-conflict countries for parts of my career, including in Iraq, post-ISIS, including in Bosnia, post the Bosnian conflict. And one can say, I don't know if this is an order of magnitude more complicated, but it's certainly much more complicated. And of course, Yemen's been in and out of conflict for, frankly, 60 years since the revolution in North Yemen in the early 1960s. So I think that is the task ahead, and we shouldn't try to rush this, and we shouldn't have unrealistic expectations. I think that the Red Sea attacks have just fundamentally brought to the surface things that we were all following already, and we understood. And we understood that things needed to be shaped this way. I think, again, this just has brought it to the attention of the broader international community, that we've got to address these threats that the Houthis pose, threats that I fear would grow over time if we don't address them. But in the end, the factor to address this, nobody wants to return to a war inside of Yemen. We are trying to de-escalate in the region. We are not looking for new conflicts in Yemen. The factor is going to be the strength of other Yemenis. And there are other possible paths that Yemen will go down. I mean, there's no guarantee that we will have this ideal outcome, but this is what we need to strive for. There are other far more problematic outcomes. Nadwa pointed out one of them, and that would be a Houthi takeover of all of Yemen, which I'm confident would be disastrous for the country, disastrous for the region. It would mean Yemen as a pariah state, isolated with no development. There are other outcomes, including further, I would say, Somaliaization of Yemen, Cantonization of Yemen, that also would put development really at a great distance for Yemenis. And since this comprehensive settlement is still a ways away in the ideal case, we shouldn't not focus on other things we can deliver to Yemenis now. And that's also where we need to work. The humanitarian situation remains very poor. There are no oil exports. There are no gas exports. There are things that can be achieved well short of a comprehensive settlement if we create the conditions and if there's political will on all sides that can bring better lives to Yemenis, in particular from restoration of the Yemeni economy, restoration of private sector economic growth, restoration of hydrocarbon exports, in particular gas exports.
Thanks very much, Steve. And we've got a number of questions that come in through the Zoom Q&A. But if you want to send any, just remember that it's there at the bottom of your screen. You can throw questions in there, or if you're watching through the policy forum on our website or YouTube, you can always email questions into policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Let me ask you this, Steve. I mean, the Houthis, in my experience at least, you don't appeal to their better nature. They generally respect strength, and they're keenly aware of, balance of power between various elements. There's not a lot that scares them, I think, but there are some things, and those things can either deter them from taking destabilizing actions or make them more likely to stay within the terms of a peace deal, let's say. The balance of power inside Yemen right now, insofar as you can, I mean, do you think the PLC collectively and you know, with its difficulties and fractures, with international support, has enough strength to basically survive the first year or two after a roadmap is, you know, initiated and is beginning to work? Because, you know, the concern would be that they're very easy to pick off piecemeal, and that without much greater cohesion and a degree of military guarantees or train equip, they won't be able to deter a growing Houthi military capability, and the Houthis, being opportunistic, will take an opportunity at some point. Basically, my mum used to say, you know, if you put something in front of, if you leave something out, it's your fault if someone steals it. You've created that opportunity. You put temptation in someone's way. You know, how can we realistically deter the Houthis from using what is probably a military advantage that they have at the moment?
Michael, that's a very good point. And while we certainly don't support any of the Yemeni parties going back to war inside of Yemen, and I think Nadwa made this point as well, it is in fact very important for the government to continue its efforts to try to bring all of the security forces represented under the government, represented by the PLC, under a more unified command and control, frankly, as a deterrent to the Houthis. I know the coalition countries have been working with the government to push that process forward. But in fact, that is quite critical because we need to deter the Houthis from any thoughts about doing that. That would reignite this terrible civil war. When it comes to the PLC as a body, look, I mean, you know, we can debate a lot of, you know, minor issues. We can debate a lot of issues back and forth, but fundamentally, the PLC is a much more politically inclusive and representative body than what we had prior to April 2022 in Yemen. And yes, they do have their differences. And we in the international community, the United States, like-minded regional countries, you know, all of us are working together to try to get them to limit their differences to show a more unified front. I mean, at the same time, to acknowledge those differences that should be able to play out at a later stage in this process, when we can bring in the Yemeni people through democratic electoral processes to determine the contours of a final settlement, to determine the contours of how Yemen will be ruled. So we need to recognize those differences while also trying to, you know, narrow them for the immediate moment. And frankly, I don't see that there's an obvious alternative to what we have. So we need to work with what we have, and that's the task ahead of us.
And without asking you to, you know, speak out of school, but I mean, I asked Nadwa, do you feel more hope than fear about, you know, the possibility of the coalition countries working in unison to strengthen the PLC? I mean, I know you've got to be diplomatic, being a diplomat, yeah. But you know, what are there any signs of things changing in that regard compared to how they have been over the last couple of years? You know, we've seen high points of cooperation, and they have been quite impressive, even and including back in 2015 through 18. And then we've seen low points in the cooperation. Which are we closer to at this moment, and where do you think it's going to go in the future?
Look, I think there are always going to be differences among us, and this includes differences among Western countries about our vision and how to shape it for Yemen. And what we continue to work at with our regional countries, with our Western partners, is to try to narrow those differences and come around toward efforts that are as collective as possible. We've had a number of initiatives along those lines these past couple of years that I've been involved in. And again, it's always a work in progress, but it's something we also continue to work on.
Very diplomatic.
Very diplomatic.
So I expect nothing less. Okay, going to a couple of questions that we have coming in and sort of gathering them together. I mean, one thing that I think there's a lot of interest in is Operation Prosperity Guardian and the US-UK airstrikes that just sort of twin with that or operate in parallel to that, the proactive airstrikes. How do you think, if I can ask you, Nadwa, I mean, how do you think the US military involvement in Yemen since October, how is that landing inside Yemen? How is that being utilized by the Houthis? How much pressure do you think it's bringing the Houthis under? And how, basically, what do you think are the positives, the negatives of it? Do you see it as having had any significant impact on how the Houthis are operating?
I mean, in terms of ordinary Yemenis, they're terrified because now they were hoping that the war would come to an end, and now, we have more escalation in the Red Sea, and then we have US and UK involvement. So the airstrikes might have sort of undermined the Houthi missile capabilities to some extent, but they did not eliminate them. But for me, that's also containment. We still continue to want to contain the Houthis, to react to what the Houthis are doing. And that's simply not sustainable. Time and again, this approach has proven to be not only short-sighted, but to play into the hands of the Houthis. For me, the greatest threat from the Houthis is not their missile capabilities. The greatest threat is their ability to militarize the population and indoctrinate 70% of Yemenis who are under the age of 28. And so I think we need to think big picture. We need to think long term, and need to utilize different tools. We cannot continue to react. We cannot continue to think tactical. We need to think strategic, and we need to work with our allies in the region, but also we need to work with the Yemeni government forces. We need to strengthen the Yemeni government. We need to enable the Yemeni government to stop the Houthis from expanding. But going back to Operation Prosperity, another thing I want to see happening is try to limit the weapons coming to the Houthis from Iran. I don't know if that's even working sufficiently. I know that the US and the UK and others have intercepted different shipments, but I know from reliable sources that at least 10 ships have sailed from Bandar Abbas in Iran, reached Hodeida seaport since November 2023. 10 ships. I'm sure they didn't have vegetables. And they were not inspected. They did not report to UN inspection mechanism. And so, I doubt that the airstrikes will do much except just reacting. And again, the Houthis are 10 steps ahead of us.
A lot of people talk about, the reaction that occurs when foreign forces intervene in Yemen, right? And historically, of course, it's been very, very negative. But since 2015, we've had foreign forces, involved on both sides of this conflict, which is not unique. It's happened before, but not in such an open way. So Do you think, I mean, do you think the US is seen negatively, more negatively in more parts of Yemen now than we were 6 months ago? Or do you think it's about the same?
I mean, there was never really a strong anti-US sentiment in Yemen. I believe it's still not the case, you know. I mean, the Houthis are trying to create this anti-US sentiment, anti-Jews, and all of that. But I don't think that the general population really buy into that, especially given how the Houthis are extremely repressive and refuse to govern. And so far, I don't think it's the case. But 5 years from now, you know, an entire generation will have been indoctrinated. Um, and
Let me ask you, Steve. I mean, it's hard to imagine being fully at peace with the Houthis, and I mean that's true for Lebanese Hezbollah. That's true for Iran itself. You know, obviously, with every year that passes, greater and greater swathes of the population, have been under their control for as long as they can remember. Now, at the moment, we have this SDGT, especially designated global terrorist designation on the Houthis. What do you think the future is for that? I know you can't tell, when a designation is going to be strengthened, when it's going to be, reduced, watered down, waived, etc. But how has that changed how we have to think about policy towards the Houthis, and how has it changed the mechanisms of the peace process potentially, including, for instance, issuance of salary payments, within the Houthi areas? How's it changed your life since that came in?
Well, look, obviously the Houthi attacks on international shipping are completely inconsistent with the Yemeni peace process. If a Yemeni peace process is truly launched, one of the most important steps is moving from the truce that we've had to negotiating a permanent comprehensive ceasefire. So starting out with a provisional ceasefire and then negotiating, which could take some time, a permanent comprehensive ceasefire. You can't say there's a ceasefire in place when you're attacking international shipping. When it comes to, and I just want to go back to Prosperity Guardian and the SDGT, our aim with all of this has been to protect shipping and maintain some level of freedom of navigation. Were it not for the operations which we're carrying out with a coalition of countries, we'd see fewer ships going through the Red Sea, and we'd likely see more ships being struck by missiles and drones, with all the concomitant impacts of that, potential environmental catastrophes, seamen being killed or injured. Regarding the SDGT, Mike, again, it was put in place to hold the Houthis to account and to place additional pressure on them. I would not want to speculate on the future of that designation. But certainly while the Houthis are attacking international shipping, I have little doubt that that designation is going to remain in place. But again, going back to the bigger picture, it's really hard to talk about the Yemeni peace process when what the Houthis are doing is completely at odds with peace. Now, they may want to segregate these two issues from their perspective, but that's not something that the United States or frankly the broader international community can accept.
Mm. And, you mentioned this phrase earlier, the Yemeni factions are not going to allow the Houthis to have unbridled access to drone, missile, all these kind of capabilities that can both threaten neighboring states' sea lanes, but also could and have really altered the internal military balance within the country significantly in favor of the Houthis. My worry is the Houthis already have unbridled access, particularly since the middle of May, potentially. Do you get a sense that the maritime shipping situation has changed over the last month, do you get a sense that more ships are calling at Hodeidah and not in any sense being inspected? And if so, how is that possible under these warlike conditions we have right now when we're trying to reduce the Houthi arsenal, and yet it's quite possible they're refilling their arsenal faster than we are destroying it?
Well, Michael, we remain committed to working with regional countries, working with allies, working with, frankly, the Yemeni government as well, to continue our efforts to interdict the supply of Iranian weapons and weapons components to the Houthis. We've achieved a number of successes. When we achieve these successes, of course, we bring it to the public's attention, we bring it to the UN's attention, and we bring it to the attention of the UN panel of experts. These transfers violate UN Security Council resolution. Is it 2216? It's 2216, correct? But it's a complicated issue. It's a complicated issue given, frankly, the size of some of these components, given the fact that, smuggling of all kinds of items is traditional to the region and traditional to Yemen. But it's something we remain committed to. It's something that, we look forward to redoubling our efforts on in conjunction with regional countries, allies, and the Yemeni government as well.
Steve, just as a final thing to ask you, I mean, sometimes when speaking to Yemenis, you get the sense, and it's understandable, that they feel like external powers are pursuing de-escalation with the Houthis to avoid the overspill into the international community, whether it's threatening NEOM and Vision 2030 or threatening global shipping. But all it might do ultimately is to lock Yemenis inside a cage with a tiger, the Houthis. And as long as the tiger doesn't get out of the cage, internationals maybe don't care so much. I know that's not how you think of this issue, but what would you say to Yemenis who feel as if the peace process is really mainly aimed at containing the crisis within Yemen without necessarily offering a realistic way to prevent the Houthis from both permanently controlling the larger portion of Yemen's population and indoctrinating them, but also potentially expanding their influence within the country and thus within the Arabian Peninsula, Indian Ocean, and Red Sea?
Well, Michael, as I said, I mean, that's not, the end state that we desire. It's not an end state the regional countries desire. It's not an end state that Yemenis desire. We simply have, a very difficult and complicated road ahead of us to bring about a better end state. But honestly, I don't think the United States, I don't think that regional countries, I don't think that our Western allies, I don't think that the aim of any of us is to simply contain this within Yemen, because it's not really containable within Yemen. We've seen this threat. We've seen it extend not just into the Red Sea, but farther along into the Indian Ocean. And it's something that we are all grappling with and will continue to grapple with.
Understood. And I can only imagine the practical challenges of trying to make this as good as it can be. So thanks very much for all of your efforts.
I mean, because I know we spoke, Mike, not so long ago. I mean, we also have to marry this up, with the broader international community and all the challenges we're facing. And Yemen is a very important challenge. But in terms of, diplomatic effort, in terms of resources, it's honestly, as a diplomat, going to be balanced against a lot of other challenges. So Yemen is going to remain a very important focus for the U.S. government, and I think for the broader international community, certainly for the region. But in terms of all of the tools that the international community can bring to bear, we're also going to have to maintain a sense of what is realistic, and also what realistically Yemenis can actually deliver. We shouldn't have any illusions about what Yemenis can deliver either. We talked about divisions within the PLC, but if you speak to Yemenis, what they will remind you of is this is what Yemen is like, these kinds of divisions. In a way, it's problematic, but also it is a certain kind, reflects diversity in Yemen, political diversity, that is what we have in this environment. And we're going to have to work with that reality.
And, one thing, from operating at local level in Yemen is that sometimes the local solutions that are put together can be truly outstanding and impressive. It's not a replacement for things being the way they should be at either the federal or the regional level inside Yemen. But it's certainly a huge credit to Yemenis.
I want to comment and emphasize something there, and I think it goes back to actually some things Nadwa said as well. Again, we don't want a warlord's peace in Yemen is not going to lead to a comprehensive resolution of this conflict. We need to have not only a politically inclusive process, but a process that really does bring in Yemeni society, or else it's not going to be a stable solution. And that does seem far off right now, but that's also what we have to strive for, or else we will not reach that end state.
Thank you very much, Steve. So Nadwa, any final words before we close out today?
Yemen has always been a strong society. There are no divisions among Yemenis as a society. The divisions are among political actors and armed groups. And I agree with Ambassador Fagin, is that we need to embrace complicity in Yemen. We need to work with complicity, and we shouldn't seek simplistic solution to a very, very complex problem. But we also need to be realistic of what can we do now and what's achievable. And so we need to proceed with caution when it comes to pushing for peace or working with the various forces.
Yeah, it's a good closing point that we need to consider the risks of peace as equally as we would the risks of conflict. So thanks very much for joining us, Steve, and thanks very much to Ambassador Mohammed Al-Jaber as well for joining us earlier. Thank you so much, Nadwa, for joining me here in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to see you as always. Thanks very much for everyone who joined us online. If you need to rewatch any of these, this piece will be on the Washington Institute's website in perpetuity. So you can come back and take another look, or you can send on the link to other people who may want to watch what we've been talking about today. So thanks very much for joining us, and I'll see you next time.